Okay, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you again. Welcome everyone to our session. It's good to see everybody here on this Friday afternoon. Um, Today, this is our third topic that we have been kind of presenting to you over the last couple months. And today's topic is titled Who is an American? The Immigration Debate and Historical Perspective. So for those of you that are just joining us today and haven't had an opportunity to see any of our topics over the last month, this is part of our anti-racism seminar series. And these professional development opportunities are brought to you by Classified Fresno City College and DO Classified Senate, our FCC faculty, and our Student Equity Department. This is professional development specifically for you as a classified professional. My name is Andrea Torres. I'm part of Classified Senate. We also have Susie Nitzel, our professional development coordinator and our Senate president, and as well as Nylene Clark, who's one of our senators also. So like I mentioned, our title today is Who's an American? The Immigration Debate and Historical Perspective. And it is presented by our very own Paul Gilmore, FCC instructor here at Fresno City. And just a little bit about Paul before I go ahead and go into the description. He's taught for Fresno City here for 18 years. He teaches US, California, and world history, as well as global issues and the history of the civil rights movement. And in all these classes, Paul focuses on the role that ordinary people play in historical events. He also addresses the way the constantly shifting meanings of race, gender, and class in our past has shaped and changed American identity and what it means to be an American. In today's seminar, Paul will talk about the immigration debate, which is nothing new, right? In fact, the question of who gets to be an American is constant in our history, stretching back to the colonial era. This history has been punctuated by periodic movements of great fear, hysteria over newcomers coming to this country. Today, Paul will try to move us away from the debate as presented by the screaming heads on television, social media, and give us some historical context to this incredibly important discussion. He will also try to show how the debate has always been about much more than immigration itself and is instead bound up in partisan rivalries, in racial and ethnic prejudices, and in American identity itself. This short historical introduction will hopefully provide important context for understanding the current controversy over immigration and for coming to your own understanding about what America should be. With that, I will turn it over to you, Paul.
Hey there, everybody. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the organizers, Nylene and Susie and Andrea, and the Classified Senate folks, all these folks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I think this is a great idea. And I appreciate you all for coming in on a Friday afternoon and doing this. I'm going to share my screen, and every time I share my screen, I screw it up at first, but we will work it out. Here we go. What I'm going to do is I've got a PowerPoint presentation for you, and so I'm going to put that up and I'm going to go through it. But when it comes to questions that you're doing, if you have questions, just type them into that question box there. And I think Nylene is the one who will interrupt me and shut me up when she feels like it's okay. And I can answer some questions. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to also answer more questions or get into comments and so on. But there we go. I've shared the screen, and let's do it this way though, just so that you can only see the PowerPoint. So yeah, as was mentioned here, I gotta do something else here. Oh my goodness, here we go. Now it's covering it up. Oh, it'll all get better. I make these mistakes on purpose so that everybody feels comfortable. You know, it's always nice to see some incompetence at the very beginning of any presentation. All right, well, enough of that. Well, So the topic here today, immigration. It's almost always a timely issue. It's an incredibly important one, and one in which emotions run hot sometimes. But as Andrea pointed out in the introduction there, I'd like to kind of step back a bit and give us historical perspective, partly because I think history is incredibly important. And it's what I do, and so I know something about it. But also because it does help us cool down a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of in that introduction, I talked about the screaming heads on TV. There's a lot of that kind of stuff, and I'm one of the people who thinks that there might even be some place for that in some forums. But it's good sometimes to approach these things maybe a little bit more soberly. This said, I'm not going to treat this like it's some sort of history class. I'm going to offer a little bit of my own views about this stuff, as well as give you a bit of some history. The way I think about starting this is by just asking this basic question: what are some of the issues being raised about immigration right now? Sometimes when we think about, I mean, immigration comes up again and again in American history, but if we think about the issues that have been bandied about for the last 4 or 5 years, you kind of see that there are differences in every era, little differences. So, one of the issues that people have brought up over the last 4 years is the wall, building the wall. And you might have remembered some guy who used to be president, totally forgotten now. But this guy, he would always talk about build the wall, the big chant, build the wall. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the story wasn't about a wall at all. The story was very little about a wall. The story seemed to be mainly about what people called the issue of illegal aliens, or undocumented immigrants. 50 years ago, it was something else. 100 years ago, it was something else. But the issue of immigration itself keeps on cropping up. I guess I should mention that today, another big issue that people have been bringing up for the last 4 years is it could almost be summarized with kids in cages, right? You've heard that, I'm sure. Well, at the risk of downplaying the importance of the issue today and of the various elements that are being brought up in recent months and years, I would like to just make this kind of basic point. I'm sure you've heard this before. You've heard people say this about history, and you've probably heard this is why we should learn history, that history repeats itself. Historians always say, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. And we always add to that, sort of, but not really. I mean, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. But I like that. I forget who said that. Actually, for the longest time, I said that was Mark Twain. And being an historian, it's not smart to get your quotes wrong, but I guess Mark Twain never said that, just so you know. But I like it. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Let me set the scene here. Here's a familiar scene for you. A politician complains of the presence of immigrants in his city and neighborhood. He asks, why should we allow these people to, and this is an actual quote from our history, why should we allow them to establish our language and manners to the exclusion, establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? He complains that these new immigrants are coming in and they're not going to assimilate and so on. They pose a threat to America as we know it. It's a very, very familiar scene. Our community is becoming a colony of aliens, that word that we use all the time to describe migrants, aliens. Now, I've got a picture of Donald Trump, of course, right away here. I mean, but this could be Pat Buchanan 25 years ago, Samuel Huntington 15 years ago. I mean, well, actually, let me just remind you of this kind of language. It's pretty clear, I think, in this particular.
The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. Thank you. It's true. And these are the best and the finest. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting. And it only makes common sense. It only makes common sense. They're sending us not the right people. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East. But we don't know, because we have protection, and we have no competence. We don't know what's happening. And it's got to stop. And it's got to stop fast.
That was the very first day of Trump's campaign. I think it's really significant. I know that we're done watching Trump and we're done hearing Trump and all of that stuff now that he's no longer president and so on. But I think it's really significant to remember this. He knew, his aides knew, other people knew that there was a particular button that he could press in America that would get a big response, that would get an explosive response. He knew that this issue was one that was a real, well, hot button issue. And he knew that, I would argue, because this is so, this kind of rhetoric, the hysteria around immigration is, I hate to say it this way, but an American tradition. Like I said, it's a familiar scene, a politician complaining of the presence of new immigrants in the city. Why should we allow them to establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Our community is becoming a colony of aliens. And the next part of that quote is this: colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them. Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them. So obviously that can't be Trump, because actually, Trump is for Germans. Well, anyway. No, it's Ben Franklin in 1751, before we were even a country, before we were even the United States of America. He was talking about Pennsylvania and how Pennsylvania was letting in this flood of immigrants, this flood of aliens, all these Germans who are going to Germanize us before we Anglify them. I think this is important because it helps us frame that current debate here. This, folks, is nothing new. I'd like to go out on a limb here and suggest that although the issue of late has been framed as a problem over the last 15, 20 years, it's been framed as a problem of undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens. It's been framed as a problem of refugees seeking asylum. It's been framed as children at the border. It's been framed as the wall, build the wall. But I would argue that if we look at this historically, it's really fueled by a larger nationwide anxiety, a long, long history of this anxiety, as I said, an American tradition of this anxiety over immigration in general. Immigration policy, no matter what time period we're talking about in American history, immigration debates, I put it in quotes because sometimes I think it's avoiding the actual issue, throughout American history have at root, I would argue, been about one central question, and that is, who is a true American? Who gets to be a real American? This has always been a source of enormous debate and anxiety among people all the way back to Ben Franklin in 1751 with his anxiousness that it's going to be a German place and not an English one. But it goes further. I mean, we can move our timeline up to the early 1790s. You know, who gets to be a true American? Well, John Adams, who was president of the United States at this time, John Adams basically looked around him and said, well, we've got a lot of French immigrants coming in. We've got a lot of Irish immigrants coming in, and they should certainly not be Americans. You might remember from some high school or college history class where you learned about the Alien and Sedition Acts. And almost everybody focuses in on the Sedition Acts, where John Adams made it illegal to say bad things about John Adams. But people forget, and that's true. He did that. He put people in jail for saying bad things about him. You know, a total violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution. But they also pushed through the Alien Act, which was basically trying to do the same thing, and that is to attack his own political enemies by saying, all right, it's going to take many, many years for you to become a citizen of the United States. Instead of 5 years, we're going to make it 12 to naturalize you. So that because there are these aliens in our midst, enemy aliens, people from France who are not part of the United States yet. We don't want them to become US citizens. Adams was trying to whip up a war with France at this time. So we don't want them to become US citizens. We don't want the Irish to become US citizens. Why? Well, they're going to vote for the other guy, frankly. They're going to vote for Thomas Jefferson, maybe. So there you have another incident here of right at the very beginning of the country. I mean, the country is only really under the Constitution 9 years old at this time when these acts are passed. And right away here, there is this issue over immigration. But we can jump forward again. We can jump forward throughout the 19th century and see this again and again and again. In the case of the 1840s and 50s, a kind of forgotten political party, the American Party, it was called, better known as the Know Nothings, which I love. The Know Nothings. You know, their agenda seemed pretty ignorant, so Know Nothings, you know, seems fitting. But that's not they're called Know Nothings because they started as a secret group. And when somebody said, hey, are you a member of the American Party? You were supposed to answer, I know nothing. Well, notice what it says. Native Americans, beware of foreign influence. This is a flag of the American Party. Now, when they say Native Americans, they are not talking about American Indian nations, Native American nations. They're talking about native-born Americans of basically of English descent or British descent. They're talking about this guy. This is one of their posters. It's hard to see it, the actual words, but at the very top it says Uncle Sam's youngest son, and right below him it's citizen. It says citizen, and then below that it says know nothing. The idea was this was the know nothing ideal. This was supposed to be the citizen. If you're familiar at all with the movie Gangs of New York, that Scorsese movie with Daniel Day-Lewis and Leonardo DiCaprio, the Gangs of New York is actually based on a somewhat true story of American Party agitators going up against Irish immigrants. And this introduces a piece of our story that I think is kind of important, and it'll get reiterated again and again throughout American history. But it's a fear not just of the newcomer, but of fear of that newcomer's language, a fear of that newcomer's culture, that newcomer's religion. It's treating the Irish as a separate and unequal kind of person. So in the case of the 1840s here, DiCaprio plays Irish immigrant, but the key thing here was that they were Catholics. And a lot of native-born Americans looked at Catholics as being un-American. And right here, I think it's a good moment to just make a point about that. Today, I think we look at the Catholic Church as, frankly, as American as apple pie. We look at apple pie as American as apple pie. But there were times when these institutions were not seen as quote unquote American by those who had already built up the community. They were seen as a threat. And in the case of Catholicism, huge numbers of native-born Americans looked at Catholicism as a foreign threat to them. I'll come back to this. I think it's an important thing to bring up because we see this again and again in different ways throughout American history. Oh, and there's the supposed, there's Daniel Day-Lewis, the butcher, if you remember. He was the butcher. Man, that was an interesting movie. Well, anyway, maybe some other day I'll talk to you about that. Jump ahead another 40 years. Can you see what we're doing? Jumping ahead. This is actually our key moment of immigration in America. When people talk about how America is a society of immigrants, I think a lot of times they're talking about this moment, this 40 years here from the 1880s up really through the 19-teens. Up until World War I, when immigration kind of stopped because the world started to kill each other. So we see 22 million immigrants come into America between 1880 and 1920. To give you an idea of what this means, 22 million immigrants coming into a country that at the beginning of this period had perhaps 75 million people, somewhere around 75, 80 million people. In other words, we were no more of an immigrant nation than we were in the 19-teens. That is, when you take the number of people who are the sons and daughters of immigrants or who are just off the boat themselves, when you add them up and consider them as a proportion to the total population of the country, it's really about 1913 when we had the highest level of immigration in our history. We're getting close to that again, but take a look at it here. This is just persons obtaining legal permanent resident status. Now, here's the thing. You see the numbers there, hundreds of thousands, but take a look in the 1880s and 90s and early 1900s. Especially in the early 1900s, let's say 1898 to 1910, it goes up to 1.2 million a year, people obtaining legal permanent resident status. If I can make a little bit of an aside here, and then I'll get back on track, but if I can make a little bit of an aside here, and if we look at this incredible increase rate in this area, 1900 to 1910. A lot of people today, they talk about how, folks coming into America today aren't getting in line like they're supposed to. My great-grandparents came here legally, and these other folks aren't following the rules. for Europeans and for people of the Western Hemisphere too, there was no such thing as undocumented immigration, really, in this era. There was no line. There is no line today, but the way you could get to be a citizen of the United States in, let's say, 1906, is you get yourself before a judge and you say to the judge, I would like to be a citizen of the United States. That's what you do. And then you have to wait a certain amount of time, but you're going to be a citizen of the United States if you're from any of these places in Europe. So this idea that my grandparents did it legally, well, there's hardly a way to do it illegally. We invent illegal immigration in that modern terminology, really in 1965. I shouldn't say it that way, I'm sorry. In the 1920s, we invent it. And then in 1965, we reinvent it. But in 1900 and 1910, you could come to America from Europe or from Mexico and just say, hey, I want to be a citizen. I love this picture. This is such a great one. Mulberry Street, New York City, 1900. It's one of the most famous pictures of sort of immigrant America. It's sort of a stand-in. It's even been colorized, but you get a sense of this Italian world on the street, this urban world. It's just a beautiful, beautiful picture, I think, and showing this, these teeming, the idea of the teeming millions, all these folks coming in. Well, I don't want to make light of the current debate, but as I've been trying to suggest here, we've been through this before. And I think, actually, let me make this point here. If you look at this graph here, or these two maps, this comparison of the 1880s versus the early 1900s, what you see is a shift in the demographics of immigration in that key period, the 1880s to the 1920s, right? You see this real shift happening right around the turn of the century, 1890s and early 1900s, from Northern and Western European immigration to Southern and Eastern European immigration, from the old immigration of Northern and Western Europe to the new, so-called new immigration of Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, no group of immigrants has ever been welcomed with just wide open arms. There's always been a little bit of suspicion. But that new immigration that you see on the right side there, those groups of folks that came in later in that period, those groups of folks were not greeted with open arms at all. If you look at the group on the left, those Northern and Western Europeans, a lot of times they had more money, they had higher skills, they spoke the language if they came from the British Empire, and so they were welcomed a little bit more, with the exception of the Irish there. The Irish were never welcomed. But when you look at those immigrants in the early 1900s, what you see is they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And here again, issues of language, issues of culture, and especially of religion come in. Italians are mainly Catholic. Austro-Hungarians, these folks, these Slavs in what is now Yugoslavia, Czechs, Slovenes, Slovaks, Austrians, all of these different nationalities very often were Catholic, or they were Orthodox, or they were Jewish. And all of those folks were suspect populations to the people in power in America at the time. They looked at those folks and their religion as a real problem. Now, I mean, we have this story of America as being established as a haven of religious freedom, but we really should temper that. You look at this story of immigration and you think, and you should temper that story with basically this. For instance, let's talk about the Pilgrims for a second here. These Pilgrims coming to Massachusetts in the 1600s. They came here for religious freedom, but we never finished that sentence. They came here for religious freedom for themselves, and really nobody else. If you were a Catholic and you were a practicing Catholic in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1600s, they would banish you. They would kick you out. And if you remained, they would punish you severely. There are occasions of Quakers having their tongues pulled out and a knife jabbed through it to give you an idea of religion. So there's a fear of other religions, I guess is what I'm saying. Even within Christianity, Orthodox or Catholic are Christians just like Protestants, but there's a real fear and nervousness about them. That new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe was treated as not the right kind. Again, a familiar story. I just love this picture of the tenements in Chicago, these houses and so on. All these cities that all these cities in the late 19th century that we hear about, these big industrial cities, New York and Philadelphia and Buffalo and Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee. I come from Wisconsin, so, but these cities were immigrant cities. In the 1880s, Chicago was 80%, 80%, 8 out of 10 were either new immigrants right off the boat or the sons and daughters of immigrants. That's really something. So the United States, I think, has, let me begin to make some general comments about what maybe all of this means, and maybe take some conclusions out of this. And this will take a while, but let me make these points here. First of all, I would say that the United States has a split personality on immigration, a kind of, in our culture, in our day-to-day discussions of the United States of America, it seems like we as a people in the United States are simultaneously proud and happy to be a nation of immigrants. And then at the exact same time, as a nation, we're scared to death of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants, scared of immigrants. It's a weird tension within our society. So I say we've got two views. The first view, of course, is right there on the Statue of Liberty. And for me, this is just an amazing thing. I just love the Statue of Liberty. And I mean, not just the statue and the beauty of all of that, but the idea around this, that this statue is a statue, shouting welcome to people from all over the world. And we're used to hearing the poem that's at the base of that statue. We're used to hearing this poem, but take a look at the whole poem. It really is something, and it expresses this, what I would think is the best view of Americans, this really welcoming, open to all kind of view. But it's even better. Just listen to this poem. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land. It's talking about the Colossus, right? This big, angry, aggressive statue, right? Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Twin cities, this is Brooklyn and New York. It's before New York City. You had, well, anyway, enough of that. Here it goes, though. Here's what she says. Right? And you've heard parts of this before, I'm sure. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe freed. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Basically, it's saying, take your rich and your well-born and all your snooty lords and ladies and leave them in Europe. What we want is, these hard scrambling working people coming to America transform this place. Your huddled masses. I'm sure everybody's heard that before, the huddled masses. But what does that mean? It means the poor. It means exactly these new immigrants that I was talking about before that were hated so much. So on the one hand, you have this ideal of a welcoming, open country. And then on the very other, right away, you have this other idea that, notice the poem, it says, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore, give these to me. I lift my lamp by the golden door. And then you get the attitude of the people, the general attitude of lots of the people, this European garbage ship. That's you can't quite see it there on the PowerPoint, but the ship says European garbage ship. We're dumping all the worst, right? This is exactly what Donald Trump said in that quote, right? They're not sending their best. They're sending their worst. And so that split personality is there, folks. It's there throughout American history. Actually, I don't know if anybody had any questions or comments so far. I don't know if anything came up in the chat. Nylene or anybody, do you have a question, or should I just keep going?
Keep going, no questions yet.
Okay. Well, let me talk about a few reasons why I think this crops up again and again and again in American history. I like this one, this political cartoon here. In the 1780s, papist immigrants are wrecking our economy with their fecundity. We must build a wall of brass around the country for the exclusion of Catholics. That's what they're saying in 1780. I've been arguing that they're saying that in 1900 too. 1850, 1920, now it's the same kind of thing. Nativism is the term we use to describe this. Nativism, native-born people looking at the newcomers and saying, well, they're not like us. They're the bad ones. We want good ones, that kind of thing. Well, one of the reasons I think why this crops up again and again is because it can be used. This fear of immigration can be used to whip, can be used to mobilize people for particular political ends. In other words, there's a cynical side to this. People know that there's a fear of the different, a fear of the foreign, a fear of the new, and so they figure they can make political hay of this. And you see this again in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s in the anti-Irish campaigns that were, and I don't mean to focus all on the Irish here, but the political cartoons of the age portraying Irish people as apes, as you see here. I mean, just incredibly racist cartoons. There's a great book, by the way, called How the Irish Became White. I don't know if you've been informed of that book, but it's really, really interesting about race formation. People not really considering Irish people white, which seems counterintuitive, right? But here you have another really racist cartoon here about the Irish. We got to watch out for the Irish. They're going to change America into something we don't want it to be. Here's another one, a famous cartoon out of Harper's Magazine. You've got all of these Catholics coming to America, and they're going to take it over, and we're going to, the Pope is going to rule America, right? So we need to politically organize now against these Irish folks. Now, this just happens to be, this is Republicans complaining about Democrats. The Democrats were the party of the Irish in the Northeast, Irish Catholics in the Northeast, and the Republicans were the Protestant party. And so you get a sense of that. Republicans in the North were. American political history is very complicated and strange this way. So the American River Ganges. But let me show you a little piece of this here. There's the actual Harper's Weekly page. But notice what we see here. We see a man protecting children, and they're being attacked by these crocodiles. But if you look closer at those so-called crocodiles, whoops, let me get to that. darn it all, where are I thought I had the crocodiles. And if you take a look at those crocodiles, they're bishops, they're priests crawling out, about to eat and destroy these innocent Protestant children, right? That's kind of the idea there. Tammany Hall is the Democratic Party headquarters of New York City. And here are some Irishmen leading a woman off to the gallows. I mean, this is, if we allow these Irish to come in, they're going to destroy good old America, right? Here's another even more vicious racist cartoon here. These images are just, to me at least, incredibly disturbing. You've got Uncle Sam is being swallowed up. He's being swallowed up on one hand by the Irish, who are a hated group of immigrants, but a group that was even more hated, more than just about any group in all of American history, the Chinese. So you've got Uncle Sam being swallowed up by the Irish and the Chinese, and then in the end, this Chinese person swallows up the Irishman, and there we are. We're left with just Chinese people throughout the country. The hatred of the Chinese was on orders of magnitude more than even those new immigrants from Europe. Our first law barring a group of immigrants, just barring a group of immigrants by geography, was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Mainly California is responsible for that, so it's something for us to live down. The Chinese here in Fresno and throughout the valley, there were several pogroms against Chinese people. That is, Chinese folks were working in the fields and working in other jobs that white folks thought that they should have access to, and so they attacked the Chinese population. In Sanger, they burned down Chinatown, rounded up Chinese people, put them on trains and sent them out, expelled them. In LA, there was a mass lynching of Chinese people in the 1870s. And so you get a real vicious anti-Chinese sentiment. And that's our first example of a modern exclusion of people. You can't even come here. Now, Chinese people could come here before then. Other Asians could come here even after 1882, but they could never be citizens because there was a racial character to citizenship rules. You cannot be a citizen if you're from Japan or if you're from China or if you're from Africa. You have to be considered in some way white, which is a complicated category, but citizenship was reserved to white immigrants. You could come here and live here your whole life, but you could never be a citizen. The kicker here is, and maybe I'm getting into too much detail now, I'll move on in a moment, but the kicker here is we have a 14th Amendment in this country now. In 1868, as part of an effort to extend guarantees of rights to Black people in this country, the former enslaved population, we passed the 14th Amendment, saying that if you're born here or naturalized here, you're a citizen of this country, which for me is amazing. That's view number two in our two views. I mean, that's view number one in our two views of immigration, the split personality. Think about that. If you're born here, you're a citizen. So this country has a citizenship rule that says, if you come from China, you cannot be a citizen here, but your child can, and your children's children will be citizens. And if anybody wants to ask me about that at the end of this thing, there's an interesting story behind that. But it's more than it's not just the Chinese on the West Coast. Back east, there was a real fear of these Eastern Europeans. Here's a kind of whipping up a fear of Jewish immigrants. You can see it here with his barrel. It says Sabbath desecration on it. So he's referring to Jewish people and keeping their businesses open on Sunday, having Sabbath on a different day, and so on. Also, immigrants bring bombs, and again, we see this right down to today with talking about drug gangs coming in here. Back in the early 1900s, it was immigrants with their radical political ideas. They're anarchists coming to bomb us all into smithereens. The caravan. Remember the caravan? Remember how desperate we all were that this caravan was coming, and then after the election, nobody cared. In the early 1900s, we see a real renewed interest in race literature. That is racist, pseudo-scientific racist literature. So Madison Grant's book was one of the most popular of the era, The Passing of the Great Race. And there he said, here's the reason why we need to restrict immigration, because immigration will mix people racially. And it will mean that the Anglo-Saxon race will dilute its gene pool and become will have an inferior race, because the superior ones, the white Anglo-Saxon folks, are going to marry and have kids with Polish women and men and Italians and Eastern Europeans, and this will destroy the great race. This was a favorite book of Adolf Hitler, but also a best-selling book here in the United States. Another one, The Rising Tide of Color, Lothrop Stoddard, talking about this tidal wave of people of color in the world that are going to come and destroy us all. These kind of racial fears are deep-rooted in American history. Riffraff immigration, the concern over riffraff immigration here, danger to American ideas and institution, these new folks coming in. In the 1920s, the United States decided to pass quota laws, a quota law, basically excluding people from Southern and Eastern Europe. I won't go into the details of it, but basically what it does is it says, look, if you're from Italy, or you're from Poland or Russia or Greece, you can't come here anymore. Or the numbers are so few that it's effectively stopped immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Northern and Western Europe, you had a much better chance of getting in. Eastern and Southern Europe, very little chance. That was the point. They wanted to keep those other, at the time they talked about Italians or Greeks or Russians as a different race. So the idea was we want to reserve America for white immigrants. And what they meant by white was something bigger than just skin tone, right? They meant a whole cultural package, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. That's who they wanted to bring in. And this gets us to this other thing. Actual immigration policies always have partisan effects. They give electoral advantages to one party over another. That's one of the reasons why we see this issue constantly coming up during election periods. It's a kind of, to be cynical about it, it's manipulation, right? I say ethno-cultural voting patterns. This is one of the not so secrets of American history. My father is a Presbyterian minister whose family comes from, Pennsylvania via Tennessee, but Pennsylvania. So a Protestant, white, Presbyterian of Scottish descent. The chances that my grandfather, my father's father, the chances that that guy was a Democrat was almost zero. Even my father, who's never voted for the Republicans in his life, kind of considers himself a Republican. And I try to explain this to him, but then he always says, hey, you're calling me a racist, aren't you? Well, no. But no, there's this sort of, in the same way, if you're an Irish Catholic from Boston, the chances that throughout most of American history, the chances that you're going to be a Republican are almost zero. If you're an Irish Catholic from Boston, the chances that you're a Democrat are almost 100%. And so you can see how immigration policy affects this, this political calculation that people are engaged in all the time. And we don't have to talk about it in 1900. Let's just talk about the last few elections. Here's the Latino vote, Obama versus Romney, 2012. I mean, this is a vast difference between Republican and Democratic voting numbers. Here's another one, a poll gauging support for Trump among Latinos. And people made a huge deal in this last election about how Trump and the Republicans made gains among Latinos this last go round. But it's still the vast majority are voting for the Democrats. Both political parties know that. And certainly that will shape their position on immigration, that will shape the way that they use the immigration issue to mobilize their voters, to mobilize folks, to create an issue out of it on social media or on Fox News or MSNBC. This is a huge part of our story here. Another major part of our story is that immigration policy, combined with the racism of this country historically, is used as a way to control the labor market. It's a way to get more stuff out of the ground, more wealth in people's pockets for less price, for lower wages. We've all heard this phrase, immigrants do work that Americans won't do. And we never finish the sentence here. And that is, for the wage that is offered. People always talk about how we can't find people to do certain jobs. You know what? You pay me $150 an hour plus benefits, I'll do just about anything. And we see this again and again throughout history. If you can make rules so that immigrants are kept out, that immigrants have to, that there's an incredible difficulty for immigrants to get into America, then then those who do make it here are more vulnerable and less able to command higher wages, especially when you consider that native-born Americans, very often for reasons of racism, won't join in common cause with those workers to raise the wages of everybody. And you see here this kind of fear of a native-born American worker, of a pauper laborer from another country. And of course, it all goes back to the Simpsons here, this kind of play on these racial ideas of where people belong in a labor market. Now, personally, I hate this part of our history because for me, at least, I always want to go back in time and grab people by the neck and shake them and say, look, why are you trying to keep people out? Why don't you just join in solidarity with them across racial lines? And then everybody's conditions would be raised. But that's not the way our history has worked, sadly. Even among the union movement, who's supposed to know better, I would argue. But racism and nationalism often trumps solidarity in our history. Here's a speech given to Congress to give you an idea of the virulence of this, trying to renew the exclusion of Chinese people from America. The name of the speech, Meat versus Rice. American manhood against Asiatic coolieism. Which shall survive? The idea, of course, was that Chinese people didn't need to eat meat like white people did. And so therefore they could undersell their labor. And so therefore we need to keep them out. These kinds of racist arguments go on and on. And then of course, getting closer to our time, the post-war period, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we have the Bracero program, importing Mexican labor and keeping those folks vulnerable so that we could get cheap wages to pick the crops in this valley, and then send them back to Mexico if possible to pick up a portion of their wages. in my California history class, we talk about this a lot. There's a great song by Woody Guthrie called Deportees, or Plane Wreck at Los Gatos. And a guy, Tim Z. Hernandez, wrote an incredible book about these braceros who died on that plane wreck, and who were not named in the newspaper or on the radio. All they will call you will be deportees, is the way the song goes. And so Tim Z. Hernandez wrote this incredible book on that. I recommend it to everybody. He goes and talks to the descendants of the people who died. And then he worked to give them an actual gravestone in Fresno. I was at the ceremony. It was the most moving Labor Day I've ever experienced in my life, where they actually unveiled a gravestone with their names on it. Well, guest workers. Back to the beginning of the argument here, and let me begin to conclude by making my biggest point, okay? Again, immigration policy and debates have often been at root about who we think we are as Americans. The question, what is a true American? And here's where we get to a really dirty, not really secret, but a really dirty part of our past. And I think it's key to understanding this fear of immigration and so on. And it's this: the United States, we in the United States love to say that we're a democracy. Or maybe some people say, well, no, we're a democratic republic. Okay, a democratic republic, whatever term you want to use. But what we built in this country in the 19th century wasn't a democracy. It wasn't a republic in the sense of all, people have a say. It was a much better term to describe it was that it was a Herrenvolk democracy. Perfect word here, Herrenvolk. That means master race. The United States built itself in the 19th century and moved across the continent as a master race democracy. That is, only those who were considered part of the master race, white men, were allowed the right to vote, were allowed the basic rights supposedly guaranteed to all. When we say all men are created equal, we very much, in the 19th century, the United States very much historically meant all white men. I know that this is something that we always talk about. It's not like it's a secret or anything, but it's something to constantly remember, folks. This is a master race democracy. And so when today people say, well, we've got all these white supremacists around and we need to really work to fight them, we have to remember that an enormous part of our history, people in charge, powerful people, loved the idea that we were a white supremacist society. They were proud of it. And it's only really been since the 1950s that and I mean that, since the 1950s, that we've had a large number of people in this country who have said, no, we shouldn't be a Herrenvolk democracy. We should be a democracy. We should begin to jettison this idea. I mean, among the very powerful people in this country, they embraced this idea of Herrenvolk, of master race, for a very long time. And you can see it in the rhetoric around immigration. This fear that if we allow immigrants in, they are going to come in and conquer us in the same way that we conquered Native Americans, that we wiped out or attempted to wipe out the other societies that were here. It's a really deep, deep fear in our culture that's being whipped up with this 21st century nativism that Trump tapped into, that other people tapped into. This anxiety over who gets to be an American. And in recent years, of course, it's been mainly focused on people south of the American border. Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, generally Latin America, right? That's where this anxiety has been focused. We had a book a few years ago, Who Are We?, coming out by Samuel Huntington. And in this book, he talks about this straightforward. He says, well, look, this is an Anglo-Saxon country. We have Anglo-Saxon traditions. And here we have all these Latinos coming in, and they're not assimilating. He's making all these same basic arguments that Ben Franklin made way back in the 1750s, best-selling book. And here's what he said, quote, Latino immigration constitutes, quote, a major political threat to the cultural and possibly political integrity of the United States. Now, this isn't some fringe website guy. This is one of, some fringe goofball off on 4chan. This is a major intellectual in America for the last 60 years. This is a guy who has had the ear of presidents and senators and so on. A cultural and political, what kind of integrity of the United States is there that could be threatened by Latino immigration? Except a kind, I would argue, except a kind of racialized version of the United States, a frozen identity. Victor Davis Hanson, Fresno's own, wrote a book several years ago, Mexifornia, talking about this kind of shift and raising an alarm about it. And then you get this kind of racist crap that came out in recent years when we talked about getting undocumented people license plates and so on. I mean, licenses for driving and so on in California. No, I think what we see in America is again and again an insistence on a frozen identity, that the United States is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country and everybody else is just visiting. This, to me, is the core of our problem with immigration. The wall, children at the borders, all of these issues that people bring up. So we don't mind immigration, it's just undocumented immigration. I frankly don't buy it, looking at this entire long sweep of history. What I see beneath all of this is a fear that this frozen identity of America is going away. Catholicism maybe has now been embraced, but not Islam, not other religious beliefs. There's, again, that fear cropping up again. It's almost like we can't handle it, right? We want America somehow to look like this. To look, Now, of course, the major organization in American history that insisted on that frozen identity was the KKK, which in the 1920s rose up to its highest power it ever had, with several million members. Perhaps 1/4 of all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men were members of the group in the 1920s. And they weren't just anti-African American, they were anti-immigrant. This was a key part. They were anti-Catholic. This is a mass protest in Washington, D.C. You may have seen these pictures before. Thousands of people, they're not covering their faces, they're proud. Here's the Klan in Fresno in the 1920s, holding a big, believe it or not, a fiesta. But if you're Mexican American, don't go. The Fresno Ku Klux Klan unmasked. And then, of course, here's this picture of a Klan rally at Ratcliffe Stadium in the 1920s to try to get a couple police officers rehired who had been part of the Klan. Sound familiar? Here's a recruitment ad in the Dinuba High School Yearbook, 1931. What does the Klan stand for? Just, the supremacy of the American Constitution, the supremacy of our laws, pure Americanism. What does pure Americanism mean? Look at number 2, white supremacy, the sanctity of pure womanhood. What else is it? It's a native-born American citizen group that wants to put America first in affections, stars and stripes, and all of that. This is not at all different from this, the Charlottesville event, or the latest, just this week, the America First caucus, arguing for a kind of 100% Americanism. Attitudes are changing, though, I would say. I think that this might be you can see where I'm coming from on this. Attitudes are changing. You can see that public attitudes towards immigration levels are changing. Some people are even reporting that they would like to see immigration levels increase. That's kind of unusual since the 1990s. You can see there in that graph another version of it based on party affiliation. So there's an alternative to the frozen identity, and it gets to this idea of the split personality of America. There's the frozen identity, the fear that America is going to become something else. But then there's the embrace of a flexible identity, a changing America, an America that is not just a melting pot, but as we historians like to say, a salad bowl, right? Where you've got Chinese, Irish, Italian, Mexican, we got all these different ethnicities and groups, and they're not coming out as all just one homogenous American, but there are many different cultures. That's the story we're getting to. I love this picture. This is Chicago, Illinois, just a few years ago, but this is Little Polonia. This is Poland in Chicago. Chicago used to be the second largest Polish city on earth behind Warsaw. This is Chicago, Illinois. It doesn't look like Chicago, Illinois, but it is. And you could ask these people in the 1890s and early 1900s, and they're eating this food and playing this, speaking Polish, and you could say, well, you guys aren't Americans. And they would say, no, we are Americans, and we love it here. Sure don't act like it. You're Catholic, you speak Polish, you got wrong kind of music, you eat the wrong kind of food, blah, blah, blah. And they would say, no. America is a great place because America is the only place that allows me to be Polish. You think about that. This is one of the great moments in American history, a place where, here's some kids at a cultural festival just several years ago, but think about Poland in 1900. Here's a map of Europe. You can't find Poland on it. If you were Polish, you were either in Germany or Russia. And if you spoke Polish, if you sung Polish traditional songs, if you wore Polish traditional costumes, if you spoke Polish, to jail you go. Because you're supposed to be German or Russian. So they moved to Chicago to be Polish. I think that's our model. I'm going to skip through a few, like I said, I had 125 slides. I'm going to skip through here, but I want you to think about that. What kind of flexible identity should America have? And I would like to end with this. This is one of our students, Mia Barraza Martinez, one of my favorite students that I ever had. Maybe some of you were familiar with Mia. She went on to Fresno State and so on. But she wrote this incredible poem in one of her chapbooks that she gave me when she was a student here. And I think it's just beautiful and gets at this idea of this flexible idea. So here we go. Excuse the way I read it, but here we go. I am, that's the name of the poem. In the picture on my green card, I look like a ghost. I hold that square of plastic. I press the corners into the skin of my thumbs until it hurts. In silence, I accept this card that came in the mail and made my mother happy. This card that says that even though I am now allowed to be. They say I crossed the border with an aunt I had never met in the back seat of a car when I was almost 2 years old. A fake birth certificate stitched to my little arm and my mother's worries tucked behind my ear. I might have sang as I slid across that border. I might have slept. This is the story and not my memory. I might have slept as we were driving past the fence, a fence that became bars of a cage, blood on barbed wire, a desert of blinding white crosses. A grandmother who died alone on an operating table in Culiacan. Her youngest daughter, my only mother, on her knees beneath the grapevines, praying for strength and inner peace, and the house payment, and patience, and gas money, and money for toothpaste, and money for diapers, and money to make money, and money. For this she prays, but I am her dream. Her daughter brushes herself against the people in the street, waving no flag but the flags of every color, butterfly blessings braiding the streets with laughter, drum beats like red and blue and orange ribbons and dark hair, singing and walking above the cracks in the asphalt, above the hunger in the lower stomach, singing and walking this old path, singing and walking this with the people in the street, these happy ghosts, these willing bones, this new sun that burns all borders. So that's Mia, just an incredible person. And as some of you probably know, she died several years ago in a car crash. But I'm showing you this, and I gave you this poem because she did come here undocumented. And I remember going to her memorial and taking this picture and thinking about this, all her friends, were there and all of this and all these pictures that were connected with her. And you see Amy Winehouse in the distance there, and you see this cloth and the candles and all of this. And I remember when I was there, I remembered, I thought, wow, growing up in Wisconsin, all of this, everything you see in this picture would have been seen by me as a kid as foreign. This not necessarily as a bad thing, but definitely as foreign. This is not American, is what I would say, as a kid growing up in Wisconsin. But this is the wonderful thing about our valley and our community and this college, I think. It's that somebody like me from the Midwest who would have, as a kid, seen this as totally foreign, sees this as so beautifully American, so beautifully us. And this is one of the great parts of that split personality of America, the kind that just says, no, we lift our lamp beside the golden door. This is just beautiful to me. And so with that, I think that will be the last thing that I say about that. And I'm wondering, okay, I went an hour and 15 minutes. I'm so sorry.
So we do have a couple of comments and a question in the Q&A. Why does the immigration and deportation system even exist? Why can't people just come and go? If someone wants to live here, drive a car, vote, work hard, raise a family, get married, etc., why can't we just let them?
This actually came up in a talk I was giving one time several years ago. And I think in some ways there's an assumption that everybody in the world wants to come to America. We kind of believe our own beliefs about this. I mean, our own what we tell ourselves about this. And we kind of forget that people in other countries, the vast majority of people in other countries would love to stay where they are. It's their home, just like we want to stay where we are. So I have a hard time answering that question because I'm kind of an open borders person. I see San Diego and Tijuana as one city, which they are. The only thing that's different is that there's a border across it, an imaginary line that we've made real. And so we do it because this is the way nations and polities have done it. But take a look at Europe over the last 75 years. We all look at Europe and we say, well, they're all basically the same. They're all Europeans. For 500 years, those folks killed each other. We're talking wars. This is the history of real war. The French and the Germans killed each other. They murdered each other in the millions, right? And now there's no border. You can't necessarily become a citizen. If you're French, you can't necessarily yet become a citizen of Germany, and Germany become a citizen of France. It's not quite there yet, but you can drive right across that border. You don't have to, there's no check. All throughout Europe, you've got that. These people were at their throats for centuries. And so I don't think it's such a pie in the sky dream to say that we too can do that. We can begin the process of allowing just free movement. I migrated here from Wisconsin. Frankly, culturally, I would say I'm a lot different I'm a lot more different from people in, let's say, San Ysidro than people in Tijuana are from the people in San Ysidro in general, right? Yet I could freely move to the border, and yet other people can't move 100 yards across that border. That to me seems a little crazy, but I am in a tiny, tiny, tiny minority in this country when I talk like that. So, you know, it's a big political fight to make that real if that's what you want to happen. That probably didn't answer your question, but it's what I got. I'm sorry. What else you got there?
Okay, another comment. Are we not, as America, as a country, an experiment?
Yeah, and that's the wonderful thing. I think that's a way to reiterate that point. We're an experiment. And I think for about 300 years, we've had groups of people in this country who have said, yes, we're an experiment and we're done with the experiment. We've decided who we are, and we've got this identity. And so therefore, unless you're going to be exactly what we tell you to be, then you can't come in. I like to look at this and say, no, we're a continuing experiment, always going on. In some ways, the U.S. has has some of the best ideas of citizenship. My sister moved to Germany years and years and years ago, and when she moved there in the 1980s, she herself, even though she married a German and produced 4 Germans, she could never herself have become a German citizen because she didn't have the blood. Now here I have just spent 5 minutes praising Europe, but there's a problem there. There's a kind of racialized idea of nationality. At our best, as an experiment, the United States is not supposed to have a racialized idea of citizens at our best. We've never come close to living up to that, obviously. We see it in the news every day. But go take a look at that 14th Amendment. If you're born here, you're a citizen. If you're naturalized here, you're a citizen. Your blood isn't supposed to matter. And that's the best part, I think, of our stuff. By the way, some people might say, well, if the 14th Amendment was supposed to be for African Americans who had been freed from slavery, you know, maybe they didn't intend birthright citizenship for Chinese people or for Japanese people or for other immigrants, you know, that have kids here. In fact, they talked about it at the time. You go back to the historical record and you find them talking about it, and they say, do we mean to include Chinese people here? And the answer, folks, yes, we do. Even though we're these ultra racists, we do mean that people who are born here, no matter what their background is, are citizens of the United States. For me, at least, that's that great experiment, a constantly flexible idea of what our identity is, not a frozen identity of somebody like me, frankly, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right?
Okay, another comment. I find it fascinating that so many white people don't see how we who are white are the real immigrants here. I find it horrifying that we are the ones so largely in control of the country and of immigration. In my opinion, if anyone should be represented so heavily and allowed to make immigration policies, it should be the indigenous people we stole the land from. If anyone should be in cages or deported, not that any living being deserves that, except maybe Trump, it should be us white people.
Well, in my civil rights class, we talk about this a lot, you know, the idea of whiteness and all of this. And, you know, this kind of identity, you know, along lines of race. And many times throughout my life, I've heard people say, well, you know, we're a nation of immigrants. We're all immigrants, except, of course, indigenous people, right? Native Americans. They're the only ones who, you know, aren't immigrants. One of the things, though, that I think is important to bring up, and it might explain why there is this kind of hysteria and fear among people called white, right? And that is what I was trying to mention before about Herrenvolk democracy, a master race democracy. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, 6 greats, fought in the Revolutionary War, right? I think I've got a 7th great here, you know, from Scotland. That immigrant to America was different, I think, than almost every generation of immigrants to come after. I shouldn't say almost every, the white immigration, the colonists and so on, and then moving across the continent, moving across the West throughout the 19th century, that's a different kind of immigrant than what we're talking about now. What we were talking about, what my great great grandparents did when they moved into Ohio and Indiana and Illinois is they committed, they attempted genocide. That's what they did. That's what those immigrants did. And so it's settler colonialism that's the main story there, for me at least. That's the story. An Italian immigrant coming here in the 1890s did not come here and say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an Italian community and we're going to wipe out the people who are here. No other group of immigrants has basically done that. And except that settler colonialist group of immigrants, my ancestors. And they set up a society that said, this is a white supremacist society. White people, not just in the South, not just in the world of slavery, in the North and the South, almost equally, actually. Even anti-slavery folks were quite racist when it came to moving to the West. The idea was to wipe out who was there and replace them. And I think deep in our culture in America, we know what we've done as a community. And I think that's where that fear comes from, that genocide was something that our community did. And some of you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Paul, that's your great-great-grandfather. Why should you feel guilt for? I don't necessarily feel any guilt for what my great-great-grandfather did, right? On the other hand, folks, we are part of a community. We always say we when we talk about the United States of America. We always say we won World War II. We won World War I. We won the Civil War from the North or whatever. We say we then. Well, if we're going to accept the good, we've got to understand that we might have some responsibility as a community, maybe not personally, but as a community, we have a responsibility to deal with that, to deal with the fact that we were a white supremacist society, proudly so. And in rejecting that, you have to do more than just say, well, we're no longer that, right? There's got to be some kind of push to make amends on that. Anyway, I don't know if that was terribly clear, but that's the way I'm looking at it. Is that all the questions or comments or anything, or was there anybody else?
Another comment came in that we need to do better.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I think, it's a structural thing, right? I think a lot of times we want to change everybody's mind, every individual person's mind. I don't know that that's necessary. I think sometimes it's finding people who are kind of where you're in basic agreement, and then trying to figure out how to make a change together. There's lots of stuff that people can do without having to convince everybody and their uncle, of your point of view. So anyway.
Thank you, Paul. So just before we end this session here, I just want to say thank you today for sharing your expertise with us. I think I can confidently speak on behalf of the entire classified professionals that are here today that we appreciate you taking this time. This was a very short and a lot of really good information. So I just want to remind our classified professionals that you have the ability to take courses here within the district for free. So if you're interested in taking one of Paul's classes or one of Marianne or Carla or Bernard, who's going to be our next speaker, reach out to your CSEA rep, see what those the details in that process is for you to be able to learn more about this and topics similar to these. Paul, do you want to take this opportunity to maybe promote any classes you're teaching in fall?
I was just typing it as you said it. History 34, AFRAM 34. It's a cross-listed class with African American Studies. The history of the Civil Rights Movement is is my favorite class to teach. Not that I don't like my U.S. history classes, but I love that class. I always get a lot of really great students there who are really thoughtful, and we have I was going to say we have a great time in that class. We don't have fun in my classes, but I think, have a lot of interesting things to talk about, very important stuff to talk about. I also teach modern US history, just basic survey, and then a class called Global Issues about global inequality, poverty, hunger, water, energy, human rights, all of that kind of stuff, global issues, which is Global Studies 2. So History 34, Global Studies 2, and then History 12, the basic US history survey.
Thank you for that. And so we do have another seminar coming up in May, at the end of May. So please join us for that session. Make sure you go in and register yourself for that. You can check out the links that are emailed to you for, other past information, and then also view anything that you may have missed along this semester. We'll be hearing from Bernard Navarro, that was a mouthful today, talking about the history of American Indians and contemporary issues. So please join us for that one as well. Thank you to the other classified professionals from our other campuses. So I see some really folks, maybe from Clovis and Madera. So thank you for joining us for that. We appreciate you coming in and supporting your classified professionals as well. With that, we will go ahead and end it. Enjoy your weekend. We're getting close to the end of the semester, so stay strong. Let's finish this strong, just like we tell our students, and we will see you next time. Have a good day.